So I'm John Cavadini. I'm professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame, and I also direct the Institute for Church Life at the Institute for Notre Dame. I'm very honored to be a guest here this evening as a friend of the Lumen Christi Institute and to be able to welcome you on behalf of the Lumen Christi Institute to this evening's event. Also, a special shout out to the Ethics Club at the Divinity School for co-sponsoring this event, so thank you. Friends, if people know anything about the irascibly brilliant 3rd century theologian Tertullian, they surely know his famously provocative statement, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" The presumed answer of Tertullian, it would seem, would be relatively little. Yet Tertullian himself powerfully deployed his formidable knowledge of Hellenistic philosophy, his knowledge of Athens, in defense of Jerusalem, thus turning the love of wisdom, the pursuit of wisdom, into a theological use, a sustained theological use. So what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem then? The premise of our gathering here this evening is a lot, actually, but also so much that the Christian sapiential tradition is inflected differently, in different ways, in different locales. For example, Rome, as Professor Brague himself has shown us in an earlier essay. Or, more to the point this evening, Alexandria. The topic of our afternoon's symposium explores the unique inflection of the combination of biblical wisdom and Greek philosophy that is, or was, ancient Alexandria. So friends, here's how our afternoon is going to work. After I introduce our distinguished speakers, Professor Brague will give a lecture with the title of the symposium, Athens, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, Christian Wisdom Between the Bible and Greek Philosophy. And then Professor Marion will give a response. Then we'll have a brief period where our two presenters will be able to interact with each other. And after that, the floor will be opened to question and answer from anyone here. Okay? Then I am honored to be able to introduce both of our distinguished presenters. Rémi Brague is Professor Emeritus of Arabic and Religious Philosophy at the Sorbonne, and Romano Guardini Chair of Philosophy at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. He's also been visiting professor at Penn State University, Boston College, the University of Navarra, Spain, and the University of San Rafael in Milan. In 2012, Professor Brague was awarded the Ratzinger Prize for Theology. Sometimes that's referred to as the Nobel Prize in Theology. He's author of numerous books, as you know, on classical and medieval culture, religion, literature, and law, including Eccentric Culture, a Theory of Western Civilization, and Law of God, the Philosophical History of an Idea. Jean-Luc Marion is the Thomas Greeley and Grace McNichols Greeley Professor of Catholic Studies and Professor of the Philosophy of Religions and Theology and Professor in the Committee on Social Thought and the Department of Philosophy right here at the University of Chicago. He holds the Dominique Duval Chair at the Institut Catholique de Paris. He's also Professor Emeritus of Modern Philosophy and Metaphysics at the University of Paris IV, that's the Sorbonne, and is a member of the Académie Française. He has written many books in the areas of phenomenology, modern philosophy, and theology, including In the Self's Place, The Approach of St. Augustine, God Without Being, and The Erotic Phenomenon. And his most recent book, to be translated into English, is On Descartes' Passive Thought, the Myth of Cartesian Dualism. So friends, at this time, maybe we could welcome both of our distinguished presenters and Professor Brague, who will come up to begin our evening.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for those so nice words of presentation. Well, I deserved them up to a point, but up to a point only. Well, all the less that I happen to be rather out of my depth on this problem. I received orders, from a man to whom it is very difficult to say no, I mean Thomas Levergood, who told me, well, you'll have to deal with the topic, the double topic, Athens, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, as first title, as subtitle, what you've just been hearing, i.e. Greek philosophy and Christian wisdom. And I told him, well, that's absolutely not my hood. Answer, never mind, do. Okay, then I stood to attention, shouted, sir, yes, sir, and okay. Tried to read what was in my own personal library from people who had some importance in Alexandria and in the attempt at synthesizing Athens and Jerusalem. Athens and Jerusalem, two cities that have acquired for some time a symbolic meaning. Professor Guardini has just been alluding to that. They stand for the two poles between which Western culture is said to oscillate. Their content can be construed in many ways: faith versus reason, ethics versus aesthetics, free inquiry versus obedience, and so on and so forth. The difference can be understood in several ways too, as an irreconcilable conflict that compels one to choose the one or the other, or as a fruitful tension that keeps the Western mind alive. Sometimes other cities are conjured up for them to complement the two. Some are said to subvert them, like Thebes of Egypt, for the German Egyptologist and theoretician of culture Jan Assmann, or like Mecca. Some other cities are said to build a bridge of sorts between them, such as Rome, or for that matter, Alexandria. In a former book, published already 25 years ago, I reflected on the Roman way. Here, I will give some thought to this last city of Alexandria. Needless to say, I will focus on the subject matter that my subtitle intimates, i.e. Greek philosophy and Christian wisdom. Let me begin with some reminders of material history, however. For besides its symbolic value, the real Alexandria, the town made of stones, as well as its population of flesh and blood, was the place of quite a concrete encounter between Athens and Jerusalem, that is, between Greek and Jewish people, on the distant backdrop of Egypt. Distant was this backdrop because Alexandria was not felt to be in Egypt, properly speaking, but rather, as the Romans said, ad Aegyptum, on the brim of Egypt. This coastal city, mainly a harbor, was founded, as the name enables one easily to guess, by Alexander the Great, together with a bevy of other cities by the same name, all along his trade of conquests from his native Macedonia to the Indus Valley. Well known is Alexandria because of the famous Alexandria Library that was founded in 288 before Christ, and that remained there till it was destroyed, unclear it is by whom. Furthermore, a philosophical Platonic cum Aristotelian school remained faithful to the ancient pagan religion, was active there especially around Ammonius. It later on shifted to Christianity with John Philoponus and lasted till Stephanus of Alexandria, who died in 642, the very year in which the city was besieged and taken over by the Arab conquest. Yet there were not only scholars in Alexandria. To the contrary, the city has a large harbor with a famous lighthouse on the island of Pharos, hence, by the way, the French name for lighthouse, phare. The city was populated mainly by sailors and merchants from all around the Mediterranean: Greeks, Romans, Jews, Phoenicians, people of all ilk. We should be careful here not to yield to one more legend of a lost paradise of coexistence, analogous to the legend of Islamic Spain, not to mention the paradises that peopled the imagination of the Western left, and unfortunately of so many French intellectuals, from Soviet Union to China, Albania, Cuba, etc. In Alexandria, coexistence between the different communities was not always peaceful. And in particular, it was far from being an exclusively positive place for Judaism, for it was there that the first anti-Jewish riot in history took place in the year 38 after Christ. Modern Alexandria in the 19th century remained for a long time a melting pot in which people of many languages and beliefs rubbed their shoulders, and in which, curiously, the language of communication was for the most part French. The well-known 4 novels which Lawrence Durrell published between 1957 and 1960 under the title of the Alexandria Quartet. You should have done that earlier, thank you. This work bear witness to that. Yet this tetralogy turned out to be some sort of dirge, since the multicultural state of affairs that it depicts was already menaced by the aftermath of the Suez Crisis in 1956, and still more by the nationalization of property by Nasser in 1961. At present, Alexandria is almost exclusively Egyptian, its language is almost exclusively Arabic, and its religion almost exclusively Sunni Islam. Well, Alexandria was not the only place in which an encounter between Greek culture and Judaism took place. This encounter began early, and in particular, it was not something new when Christianity set in with the preaching of the apostles. Hellenism had been present in the Middle East for more than 3 centuries before Christian era, since the conquest by Alexander the Great. Palestine was part of Hellenistic kingdoms, first the Lagids of Egypt, then the Seleucids of Syria after 195 before Christ. When the Romans came, they didn't drive away Greek language and mores. To the contrary, the eastern part of the Roman Empire was administrated in Greek. Alexandria was the place where the Bible was translated into Greek according to the legend by 70 old men from the Jewish community who produced the so-called Septuagint. This Greek translation made possible the diffusion of biblical ideas and practices in the whole Mediterranean basin. It was the Bible of the Greek-speaking Christians who rapidly forgot the Hebrew original, with some brilliant exceptions, such as Origenes from Alexandria. The Hebrew Bible itself is not free from Greek influence. A Greek word has wormed its way into the Song of Song, Aphirion, from Phoreion, some sort of palanquin. The word palanquin is itself a loan word from the Hindi. For as a rule, words designing material objects are more easily welcomed into other languages, especially when they designate new technical devices. As for intellectual pursuits, where they are more difficult to spot, one surmises some influence of Greek sensibility in the Ecclesiastes, in Kohelet, the style of which may remind one of Menippus of Gadara in present-day Jordan, next door to Palestine. Palestine itself was multilingual. The trilingual inscription on the cross gives evidence to the fact. Jesus may have spoken, apart from his native Aramaic and the Hebrew of the Holy Book and of the prayers, some Greek, perhaps with some words in Latin. In which other language than Greek could the interrogatory by Pilate have taken place? In the present time, too, by the way, Palestinian youngsters speak their Arabic dialect, some Hebrew, or even flawless Hebrew if they attended Israeli schools, and a great deal of English. The Middle East had been for centuries, was, and remained till late antiquity, the fruitful and creative region of the ancient Western world, as well in Persia as in Syria, Iraq, Anatolia, the present-day Turkey since the 11th century. It so happens that I was given the opportunity to point this out right here in Chicago some years ago. This preeminence of the Near East, this intellectual domination of the Near East, holds true for theological thought too. Basic tenets of the Christian dogma over the nature of Christ were defined in Alexandria against Arius with Athanasius and against Nestorius with Cyril, both of Alexandria. Well, now, this definition of the Christian dogma happened, this is a matter of common knowledge, thanks to intellectual tools that were philosophical in origin. Hence, my subtitle, Greek philosophy. Now, what kind of philosophy was available on the market of ideas in the countries in which the early church fathers were active? An important, most grassroots, but often overlooked fact is chronological in nature. With year zero of our reckoning, Greek philosophy that began around -500 and lasted under its pagan form till 529, when the school of Athens was closed, Greek philosophy was approximately at the middle point of its course. The so-called Neoplatonism was not yet there. Its late version, from Proclus on, was some sort of private property for some families. And the leaders of the schools belonged to the intermarried and so on. Greek philosophy was neither extant in the whole of its development when Christianity set in, nor for our Alexandrian authors was it available in its whole, and especially the part of it that we would now consider as most important. For the most part, philosophical thoughts were there in the popular, somewhat watered down form. There were philosophers everywhere, including in the Hebrew or Aramaic-speaking world. They are mentioned, some philosophers are mentioned in the Talmud. What was by and large on the market was what we call at present Hellenistic philosophy. Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism. Origenes, for instance, gives examples of voluntary poverty among philosophers, and he quotes Democritus, Crates, the cynic, Diogenes, the cynic as well. When he enumerates the philosophical schools, he quotes the Stoic, the Platonic, the peripatetic, Aristotelian, the Epicurean, and others which he doesn't even name. Hence a plurality of choice. The philosophers who were on Athens' Agora when Paul spoke on the Areopagus, when Paul later had to speak on the Areopagus, those philosophers are said to have been Epicureans and Stoics, the only precise names of philosophical schools that are mentioned in the New Testament. Plato was widely read. Origenes wrote somewhere that Plato was accessible to the literate only. There's a social gradient. This distinguishes, according to Origenes, again, Plato, the noble philosopher, from Epictetus, a more plebeian thinker, Epictetus, whom everybody could read. Aristotle's technical treatises were the privilege of highbrow schools that sort of kept him for themselves. If we take again Origenes' example, he tells he had some knowledge of Aristotle's life. He retells the anecdote about Aristotle leaving Athens after Alexander the Great's death, and explaining that he wanted to avoid the city a second crime against philosophy, the first being, as a matter of course, Socrates' hemlock. As for Aristotle's teachings, Origenes quotes once the Perihermeneias, the De Interpretatione, on the definition of a verb. And he mentions the peripatetic doctrine of the quinta essentia, the fifth element, out of which the heavenly bodies are made. And that's it. Clemens of Alexandria was way more knowledgeable about Greek philosophy, but I am far less knowledgeable on Clement than on Origenes, which means a great deal since my Origenes is rather shaky. I had simply no time to really delve into his traumata. Please accept my apologies. The basic tenets of the main thinkers were more often than not known indirectly through collections of opinions, what we call doxography. See, on this problem, this philosopher Jones thinks that, philosopher Smith thinks that, philosopher Brown thinks that, and so on. Not a very rewarding kind of philosophical literature. Well, one speaks of the school of Alexandria. Was there such a thing as a school of Alexandria? Some words about method. It is not enough that some thinkers should share the same views or live in the same place for us to be allowed to speak of a school. Moreover, it is not enough to observe a kinship in thought between people who never got in touch with each other. Unless there is evidence of some real continuity in transmission, historians of ideas will hesitate to speak of a school. This is why, for instance, medievalists are more and more prudent when they mention a school of Chartres in France, when the revival of Platonism in the 12th century is concerned. The first important thinker in Alexandria, and the first who was really relevant for our problem, Athens, Jerusalem, were this Jew, an older contemporary of Jesus, Philo of Alexandria, said of Alexandria. He developed an allegorical reading of the Pentateuch, looking for moral teaching in the narratives it contains, and he therefore brought to bear Stoic and Platonic ideas. The snag is that he remained without heirs among Jews, hence there was no Philonic school among them. After the redefining of Judaism around the Torah around the Hebrew Torah, the Jews neglected Philo and, for that matter, Flavius Josephus, and they sort of left them to the Christians. This lasted till the Italian humanist and rabbi Azaria de Rossi, who wrote and published in 1574 his masterpiece, The Light of the Eyes, Meor Einayim, in which he calls back home, sort of, the Greek-speaking sources for the history and intellectual elaboration of Judaism. On the other hand, Philo was heavily drawn upon by church fathers like Clemens of Alexandria. Origenes mentions 3 times the name of Philo, and in the Latin West, Ambrosius made widely use of his writings. Now, there was a Christian school of Alexandria, a school of exegesis, biblical interpretation. Its beginnings are linked with its first leader, Pantaenus, who died around 200. Now we know precious little about him. A chapter from Eusebius' church history. Something the matter with the mic. And this one perhaps should be switched off if it's not. Okay, well, I seize the opportunity for a sip of water. Oh yes, the only, next to the only source is a chapter from Eusebius' church history. He was, says Eusebius, Pantaenus was, says Eusebius, a Sicilian by birth, and he is said to have sailed to India in order to preach the gospel, and then back to Alexandria. Yet the notice by Eusebius contains an interesting observation. Pantaenus is said to have been originally a Stoic philosopher. It is difficult to say whether philosopher was a full-time occupation, a job of sorts, or simply an interest, something like a hobby, or hardly more than a bombastic name for an inquisitive cast of mind. And now, what relevance shall we attribute to the fact that Pantaenus is said to have belonged not to just any school of philosophy, but to the Stoic one? His mission to India as a Christian missionary might bear witness to his apostolic zeal, but also to the cosmopolitism defended by the Stoa. In any case, the model of a person interested in philosophy and converting to Christianity while remaining on the same track, i.e. looking for the truth, is exactly what we have in Justin, who was not an Alexandrian, but hailed from Nablus in present-day Israel. Present-day occupied territories of Palestine. Justin tells us about his itinerary from school to school, from philosophical school to philosophical school, till his final discovery of Christianity as the true philosophy. And by this token, Pantaenus' philosophical background establishes a continuity between the first apologists and the school of Alexandria. Moreover, the leaders of this school lived under the same conditions of persecution or of the threat of it as the apologists. With Origenes, we are still several decades before Constantine's policy of toleration. And Origenes wrote an exhortation to martyrdom, and this proved not to be an exercise in rhetoric, for he had to suffer martyrdom himself. What did those people had to do? What was the intellectual achievement as a possible school of Alexandria about the problem Athens, Jerusalem? They had a double task. On the one hand, they had to show that the Christian message is in continuity with two previous worlds of meaning: the Hebrew Bible on the one hand, and Greek literature and philosophy on the other hand. They had furthermore, and this is the second task, to drive a wedge of sorts between those two worlds. They had to make place for Christianity as what would be later called a third race, triton genos. They thereby fought on two fronts, endeavoring to distinguish themselves from Greek paganism and from what was about to crystallize as Talmudic Judaism. Now, both the Bible and Greek texts express a worldview which implies, too, a glimpse of the divine. The struggle was not between some secular thought, to tell this in anachronistic terms. It was between several understandings, several ways for us to understand what the divine is all about. Now, although those two corpus of texts and experience, Bible and Greek philosophy, may at first sight seem at loggerheads with each other, there is a common point, or rather a common root. And this common point or root is the logos, i.e. the verbal nature of man and of reality as a whole. This has to do with a most revealing fact repeatedly pointed out by Pope Benedict, i.e. that the Christian apologists turned to the philosophers in order to look for dialogue partners, and they didn't try to get in touch with the mystery cults whose quasi-sacraments might have looked like the Christian ones. This fruitful encounter between Greek thought, and in particular philosophy, and the biblical religion, in the singular, was not evident. It required some conditions that made possible the use of philosophical ideas or of plain, humdrum, human wisdom. It supposes a very important assumption, i.e. that there is a level of humanity that precedes its splitting asunder in different religious affiliations, in the same way as it is common to nations, races, and so on and so forth, social statuses and so on. And this common element is again the logos. Now, what were the concrete tactics of the church fathers, of the early church fathers, in order to cope with philosophy? They had an ambivalent attitude, or many ambivalent stances towards philosophy. There was first a wholly negative outlook. Philosophy is distrusted and even despised. Some simply poked fun at philosophers, like this fellow Tatian, who harps upon the trite theme of the contradictions between philosophical schools. Even Origenes says that the cavillings, the sophismata of the philosophers should be thrown into the same dustbin as the deceptions of the astrologers. Philosophers, says somewhere Aristotle, are like physicians who claim that they can cure but can't really help. They don't even cure themselves, since their lofty arguments don't prevent them from adoring idols, i.e. devils. A frequent argument on this point is that the philosophers succeeded among an elite of literate or even learned people only, whereas the Christian message appealed to simple folks, to workers, to women, almost incredible, and converted them to virtue. This is to be found in Justin and in Origenes, who claims that the message of the Christians is better known than the opinions of the philosophers. There's a second tactics. This is the commonly accepted legend that the Bible was not only older than Greek lore, which is true at least for some of its parts, but its very source. The idea is to be found among the Jewish apologists of the Hellenistic period like Philo and Josephus. And among Christians, Tatian and Origenes took it up. If philosophy is the best thing that Greece produced, Greek philosophers can be beaten on this too, for the prophets were older than the Greek philosophers, and they saw and proclaimed the truth to everybody by a method which was not demonstration but witness, martyrion. Philosophers cribbed it all from Moses. Greek philosophy is made of misunderstandings on the Bible. According to Justin, Plato read Moses but misinterpreted him. The identification of the supreme good with the imitation of God is to be found in Plato's Theaetetus, says Origenes. But Plato had it from the Holy Writ. They took things from the message of the prophets, but misunderstood and even perverted them. This is what explains the pagan myths. The pagan myths were, allegedly, to be sure, made by devils who clumsily aped biblical realities. A third and more positive characterization of what philosophy is all about and how philosophy can receive a positive welcoming in Christianity is to be found in Clemens of Alexandria. He has a characterization of Plato that can be some sort of hermeneutical key for us to understand what the fathers found in him. Plato, says Clemens, was a zealous lover of truth, and he was the reviver, zopuron, of the sparks, the Greek is enausma, of the sparks of Hebrew philosophy. An interesting phrase on which I will tell you some words later on. This is very interesting. Philosophy, according to Clemens, was present in the Bible, but as sparks only. And Plato blew on the embers and let them flare up. Plato brings what was implicit in Hebrew philosophy to an explicit conceptual formulation. And this may be some sort of a program for the church fathers, who, this is a fourth tactics, the church fathers spoke of a barbarian philosophy. As is well known, the adjective had originally no derogatory shade of meaning whatsoever, but simply meant speaking a non-Greek language. The phrase barbarian philosophy and the idea is not Christian in origin. It stems from representations found in Jewish authors like Philo, or in pagan authors like Megasthenes, about whom we know precious little, Megasthenes, who wrote an account of India, which is quoted by later authors. As for the Church Fathers, what they thereby meant with the phrase barbarian philosophy was the thought of the biblical prophets. This implies that there is some philosophy outside of the pale of Greek culture. Origenes speaks of Greek and barbarian philosophy, which a phrase that may refer to biblical authors, but also to the alleged secret philosophy of the Egyptians, or even of the Persians, of the Syrians, and so on. Each and every nation had its kind of philosophy. Now, the notion of a barbarian philosophy is worthwhile because it frees philosophy from the suspicion of being the folklore of an ethnic group, a suspicion which recurs from time to time. For instance, whenever philosophy is said to be some sort of mythology, white mythology of the Greek language, or of the whole Indo-European language family. In the 9th century already, the Arabic grammarian As-Sirafi, in his famous controversy with the translator Abu Bishr Mattar ibn Yunus, tried to reduce philosophy to Greek grammar. If you know Arabic grammar, you need no philosophy. Philosophy is simply the grammar of another language which we don't speak. This grammarian had remote heirs with a linguist who interpret Aristotle's categories as being hardly anything more than grammatical categories. For instance, the substance, the ousia, being boiling down to be what we still call substantive. Last and not least, the fifth tactics, the Church Fathers could raise their sights from language to what makes it possible in the first place, i.e. the logical ability of human beings, that which the Greek philosophers themselves called logos. And according to them, Christianity can trump up philosophy, can beat it with its own weapons, the logos, because the Christian experience of the logos is, according to them, more complete than what is afforded by the philosophers. Justin quotes the various names by which biblical language and imagery expresses the relationship between God and creation. He quotes the glory of God, the Son of God, the wisdom of God, the angel, God himself, the Lord, the Word, the army leader. All this can be a way for the Bible to express the relation between God and creation. He summarizes them all under the heading of what he calls a Dunamis Logike, a logos-like. I have to leave logos untranslated, why so various, so it's a motley concept. The logical, perhaps could do the logical power, but logical in a broader meaning that mere logics in our sense. This Dunamis Logike was, according to Justin, begotten by God before creation. This is the Son as the Word of God. And this thought is all the more remarkable that he begins his list of the different sides or aspects of this Dunamis Law. He begins his list with two features that have nothing whatsoever to do with linguistic communication, such as the glory, which designates in the Bible a visual phenomenon, some sort of light aura around the invisible God. And the second word that he puts sort of into this, or under this Dunamis Logike, is son. Sonship is a biological and social notion, nothing linguistic about it. For Justin, among the Greeks, Socrates, the patron saint of the philosophers, fought against the demons who took the shape of pagan gods, and he did that by means of logos, by means of cross-examination. Among the barbarians, Christ was the logos incarnate himself, taking the form of man and becoming one of them. He contends, this is still Justin, that Christians have over the other people an advantage. They possess the logos in its whole. The Greek is to logikon, to holon, global logos, sort of. Philosophers discovered truths thanks to the logos, but they had it only in a partial way. As for Origenes, he goes so far as to call Jesus Christ the Logos in person, auto logos, recycling sort of a Platonic way in order to designate the ideas, we can call loosely speaking the ideas. Here's the idea of logos. Now, the presence of logos in Greek philosophy hardly requires a demonstration. Therefore, I will simply take it for granted and skip it. On the other hand, the presence of something like the logos in the Hebrew Bible badly needs to be made more plausible. And this is what I will endeavor to do as a conclusion. There are philosophical thoughts in the Hebrew Bible, to be sure not as such, not in conceptual form, but in a narrative guise. Well, I already was given the opportunity to make this point so that I can here be brief. The idea, well, there are two assumptions that make philosophy possible in the first place. First, the idea of physis, the idea of a stable nature underlying any change and prior to any convention, prior to any nomos, to say it in Greek. This idea is present in the Bible in the first narrative of creation, where each being is said to have been created according to its species, i.e., producing the effects that arise from its nature, a nature that can't be changed. Is especially visible in the case of living beings. Aristotle said, anthropos, anthropon gena, a man begets a man and not a cat or a squirrel. The Bible says each living being, the plants and the animals, are created according to their species and reproduce themselves according to the laws of their inner nature. And the second basic assumption that makes philosophy possible is the idea of human freedom. Now, the Bible supposes that man is free to answer God's call or to overhear it. The biblical God engages, therefore, into a dialogue with human beings. He never contents himself with dropping commandments from above and hurling menaces against whomever would disobey them. To be sure, the biblical God has a legislative activity. 4 books of the Torah contain a great deal of commandments, positive and negative. But this activity, this legislative activity, is embedded in a story of dialogical interaction between God and human beings. And this is embedded in a story which culminates in an intervention leading to a liberation of Israel from Egyptian bondage. And the Decalogue, the so-called 10 Commandments, are to be understood as the conditions that will enable the newly liberated people to keep its freedom. And among other freedoms, his freedom of speech, his free access to a God who speaks. And this will be the central thesis of this presentation, the biblical God is essentially verbal, a verbal God, essentially logos. As the creator, to be sure, in the first account of creation, in which God speaks and things arise, spring into being. But this was the case in earlier phases in the development of biblical ideas, in which God appears as the partner in a bond, in a covenant with his people. The prophetic movement shows him talking with his people, warning it, scolding it, telling it stories, reminding him of past events by telling such stories, consoling it by nice words. And the sages of Israel became conscious of the verbal character of creation, hence of being as such, thanks to a process of deepening of the verbal nature of revelation. A verbal character that was reflected by the prophets themselves, and pretty early in the history of the prophetic movement. Says, for instance, the earliest one whose prophecies we kept. There might have been earlier prophets, but their prophecies were lost. Yeah? And this is Amos from Tekoa, who lived in the early and middle 8th century, before Christian era, as a matter of course, in the southern kingdom of Judah. What he says is, God doesn't do anything without telling his prophets the deep meaning, the Hebrew is sod, of what he does. God's doing, God's action in history, is parallel to his speaking and perhaps coincides with it. No event, no historical event is void of meaning, and this meaning takes the form of a linguistic utterance. 2 centuries later, the second Isaiah, about 540 before Christ, has a short passage in which this reflection on the verbal character of the biblical God comes to a head. Let me quote it. The God is supposed to speak. For this is the word of the Lord who created the heavens. He is God. Who formed the earth and made it. He established it solidly. He didn't create it as a chaos. The Hebrew is tohu, which is to be found, as everybody knows, right at the beginning of the Bible, in the first account of creation. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I have never spoken in secret, in some spot in the land of shadows. I have never said to the children of Israel, seek me in the void. And this is again tohu. I, the Lord, I say the truth. I declare what is right. Dober tzedek, magid mesharim. We have here what one could call the triangle of rationalities. Reason, logos, is manifest under three aspects: as the well-ordered and intelligible character of the created world, in opposition to the primordial chaos; as the clarity of verbal expression, in opposition to the discordant notes of occult experiences; and thirdly, as the rectitude of conduct, in opposition to perverse ways. Virtue is the behavior according to Logos. We are here with Aristotle, sort of. God presents himself as speaking subject and as creator. But he doesn't thereby raise the spectre of domination. Rather, he specifies the way he is going to speak. In the same way that he solidly established the earth, one can base oneself on his word. In the same way that he created it inhabitable rather than void, his affirmations display order and meaning. They are even vivifying, as an order that makes it possible for an association of men to live together. In short, civilization. God does not speak in secret. Revelation took place in the public space when it was open, not in some lost corner. No doubt the allusion is to event as Sinai, but this is perhaps not relevant here. More important is the rejection of a purely private experience, which would be ineffable, whose content would be incapable of being expressed. The revealed content is open to examination. Hence, the order of creation, the clarity of linguistic communication, the justice and appropriateness of what is communicated, all mutually reinforce one another. And those three elements form a triangle in which God shows himself to be a friend of Logos. More and more in the Hebrew Bible, Revelation takes up a verbal character. It is not the sharing of ineffable mystical experiences, nor the showing of visible images. Hence, perhaps, the sharp rebuttal of idols, i.e. of images. We don't know. As a conclusion, some words about the relevance for the present time of the early church fathers. Was the school of Alexandria successful, or at least is it still relevant for us? What early church fathers said about the Logos is grounded upon the Bible. This is what I've just been trying to show. It is important to point this out, since one could be tempted to interpret their utterances as a way for them to play footsie with Greek philosophy, jilting thereby the link with Israel and its experience of God. And this is precisely what some historians of religion and some theologians called Hellenization of Christianity, an idea that was for them some sort of betrayal of original Christianity. Now, it is according to the Bible that the whole relationship between God and creation is pervaded with Logos. Little wonder that Christianity, and in particular the early church fathers, had to look for help in the place where the Logos reached its supreme fulfillment, i.e., in philosophy. There is something, however, that can't do any longer. The church fathers, seeking for announcements of Jesus in the Old Testament, indulged too much in allegorical reading. They were eager to find everywhere prophecies of the Messiah. In fact, not this and that verse, but rather the whole of biblical experience points towards Christ, who recapitulates it, but as an external focus, as the vanishing point towards which the various elements of the biblical message or messages converge elements which otherwise would coexist without synthesis. The incarnation of the Word, of the Logos, is the coming to a head of a definite way to live and conceive of the relationship with God, i.e., the covenant, berith, which is the basic idea of the Hebrew Bible, according to my humble self at least. What theologians called later the hypostatic union, i.e. the presence of two natures, the divine nature and the human nature, in the single person of Jesus Christ, Word made man, is the peak of the covenant, is the bond made definitive and unbreakable because realized in one person. As a matter of fact, in the development of patristic thought, the period of the early church fathers, dominated by apologetics, was succeeded by the dogmatic period in which the nature of Christ, or rather his two natures in his single person, received a rigorous formulation. As I told you earlier, this happened, of all places, in Alexandria as well. And by this token, there is some continuity between the pursuits of the Alexandria Christians, who all deserved well of Christianity. Thank you for your attention.
Now, Professor Marion, if you don't mind, we'll make my remarks seated. It's always a bit difficult to comment on a lecture made by Rémi Brague because of the comprehensive scholarship he used to develop each time. But the good thing is that I can take for granted his argument and just make additional remarks more than comments. A first point, which Rémi did not completely explain, is the title of our conference this evening. Athens and Jerusalem, das mean Leo Strauss, that means Chestov indeed, but also Leo Strauss because we are in Chicago. Leo Strauss, that is Alan Bloom, that is Saul Bellow, that is all the tradition of the Straussian school in Chicago, which was to some extent rooted on the dilemma Jerusalem and Athens. And being myself affiliated to the Committee on Social Thought, I know that this. So to say Jerusalem, Athens, and Alexandria, it is in fact a polemical move in Chicago. That is to say, the two are not enough to understand the issue. There is a third race, a third way. At least a third possible direction. And it's why it's so important to be precise in detailed information about the continuity and the particularities of something like, nevertheless, a school or several schools of philosophy and theology in Alexandria. And this is my first point. Well, the second point is, to some extent, a bit the exact opposite to the first, and I may appear contradicting myself. That is, in fact, if we understand by Alexandria the third way, the third policy, we should say, but Rémi Brague has already alluded to that, we should say that Alexandria was not in Alexandria only. The best example is given by the similarity between Philo and Clemens, and even before Origen, and Justin Martyr, philosopher and martyr. Again, let us focus on this very central figure. Justin was born in Naples. He was a Palestinian. He was very well trained in old and the new Judaism who was starting, the dialogue with Trifo. And he went as a professional philosopher to settle in Rome, being openly a Christian. And so before being driven to martyrdom, he published, and to some extent he is the inventor, one apology to the emperor. And the emperor, or the son of the emperor at the moment, was the Mark Aurelius, not yet emperor, but yet claiming to be, among other titles, official titles, a philosopher. And so leading persecution against the Christian as well. And Justin asked publicly the son of the emperor, "You are a philosopher, I am too, let us discuss. And we shall argue about whether it is fair to condemn the Christians, not because of what they do, but because of their name." So there is the beginning of the apology, which is a rational discussion about faith, about freedom of faith, freedom of speech, and the public role of Christians. So, to some extent, he was doing exactly what we may call the Alexandrian, following the Alexandrian way. And there is a very good example in that. That is, martyrdom was a part of the arguments discussed by Clemens and Origen in Alexandria, as well as the martyrdom was central to Justin and all his followers, because he was a Theophile of Athens and others, Tertullian and so on. So, but don't be misled about martyrdom. Martyrdom was a rational issue. It was not opposing confession of faith, sincere, heroic, but not argumentative, opposing this to an argumentation, a philosophical argumentation for Christianity. In fact, it was the same question for many reasons. The first is that martyrdom is about the freedom of speaking, the freedom of believing, the freedom to deny fake gods and to worship only the God your consciousness allows you to acknowledge as such. So there is a philosophical issue there. And this was developed brilliantly by all the first theologians. The second thing is that martyrdom was an argument, so to speak, for the Christian against their prosecutor by saying, but there was a martyr before who was condemned because he said the truth. He was atheist to the fake gods. He was a philosopher arguing to everyone about what is known and what is not known, what is true and what is not true. It is Socrates. That is, the apology by Justin, as in the case of Clemens, in the Stromatis, for instance, is very clear. The apology is a rehearsal of the apology of Socrates by Plato. The difference between Socrates and Christ, or Christians who are doomed to martyrdom, is not that in both cases they are philosophers. They argue for liberty of thinking and worshipping. The difference is that Socrates was not aware of what exactly he was doing. And in addition to that, he died and is not resurrected. The Christians know perfectly well that when they claim to have the right to believe, to speech and think freely and worship freely, they are following the explicit revelation of God. They know that when they die, they will be resurrected in Christ. So the difference between Socrates and the first Christian martyr is not martyrdom. The difference is that it is an achievement for the Christian. It was not yet an achievement for Socrates. But it is very important to understand that the first conflict was understood by the generation of people like Justin, and after that Tertullian and Tatian to some extent, and Theophile, and in Alexandria Clemens. It was seen as a public philosophical discussion. Martyrdom is the moment when you argue. So this is quite important to understand the paradox that rationality was not opposed to the confession of faith, but the confession of faith was a claim to be rational in your behavior and your way of thinking. And it's why the Christian had a connection with philosophy. So this share clear light on another point which was emphasized by Rémi Brague, referring to Cardinal Ratzinger, who used to insist on the fact, and in fact he is quoting at that moment, as you know, Augustine, City of God, book 6 and 8, insisting on the fact that when the Christians have to discuss with the pagans, they have to check what has to be taken seriously among the three kinds of theologies, to speak like Varro, the Roman ancestor, so to speak, of Roman thought, who distinguish the Theologia Civilis, which is the political celebration of the god of the city, official, the theology on theater of the poets, where in fact the stories telling about the god leads to jokes and caricature and making the fun of the gods. And the third thing, which is the theology, natural theology, that is astronomy. Astronomy being one of the best possible approximation of the divine. And Augustine insists on the fact that Christians have only to discuss with the Theologia Naturalis, that is with philosophy. Christians are not theologians. This is for pagans, because it is not rational, or it is pure political hypocrisy. What is serious to some extent among the pagan discourse about the gods is what is more rational, that is the philosophical, what we call now the philosophical approach to the divine. And theology, in the modern sense, Christian theology, for instance, should only pay respect to the philosophical approach. Why? Because the presupposition is that the Christian discourse about God is rational from the beginning. So this is another way to stick to the same position. And this should indeed give a broader confirmation to the final point emphasized by Professor Brague, which was that for Alexandrian thinkers, Christian thinkers, but also Jewish thinkers, the point which could unify both the Talmudic Judaism just coming or yet to come, the Greek philosophy and the new partner of the debate, that is Christian theology, was the Logos. It is the Logos with the common point. The writing of wisdom in the so-called Old Testament, as repeated by the New Testament, who includes a lot of books of wisdom, could be related to the pagan, to the Greek philosophy as well. It is the rationality of God as a pedagogue, to quote the title of one of the most brilliant book written by Clemens of Alexandria. God as Logos is also developing a pedagogy, and a rational pedagogy. This rational pedagogy meets the paideia of the philosophers, the education of by the philosophers. So the problem whether the Alexandrian father did not go a bit too far when they argue not only that Bible writings were older than Greek philosophy, which is partly true, but that everything correct in Greek philosophy was borrowed, if not thieved, from the Bible. They went perhaps a bit too far. But there was something very serious there. And something which can be supported by some text of Plato, for instance, saying that the Greek philosophers are young men, they come too late, many things were established before them, in particular in Egypt. The idea is that there was a common ground between the two partners, Jewish people and Greeks. And this common point was the question of the sapientia, the wisdom, the phronesis, the prudentia, the logos. And about this, I would like to add two final remarks. First, we have to keep in mind this argument, which can be found in Justin, the first Apology, chapter 7, but many times too in Clemens, in the Stromatis, for instance, 114 and 115. The argument is what the philosophers are among the Greeks, the Christians are among the barbaroi. That is, the Christian do the same thing, aim at the same goal than the philosopher, for two different crowds, so to speak. And I think it is something we have to take very seriously. I insist on that because there was a fashion, a tradition, which was, I think, really an error to speak about the Hellenization of Christianity in the early centuries, and mostly precisely in Alexandria. But there was no Hellenization. Nietzsche is right, there were perhaps the exact reverse, that is, a Christianization of Greek and Roman philosophy. But what is clear that those two or three partners had enough in common to allow the discussion be possible on that issue. Who colonized the other? There would have been no debate about that if they did not overlap. And they overlap about the question of the logos. So no dialogue between philosophy and Christian theology, for instance, can afford to bracket the question of rationality. And I would even say this is the same rule which should be followed for the dialogue with present Judaism and Christianity. Rationality. Now, what kind of rationality? This is my last point. Because I would nevertheless make a small reservation about this possible pre- or post-established harmony. It would be to say the point where the discussion was made possible was the logos and not the question of being. I mean, it is very important to see that indeed a classical question of philosophy, of metaphysics, were not put aside. The question of creation has a relation with the question of being and all that stuff. But there was, in fact, the core of the common discussion was what I would call, referring to Clemens again, to Origen, and to Augustine, what I would call the principle of the search for happiness. This principle is very, to my opinion, very, very powerful. In fact, this formulation comes from Roman thinkers like Cicero, Seneca, and I guess others, which I have not at the moment in mind. But it was taken over by the first apologists, Christian apologists, and very well explained in many places by Augustine. The point is this: if you meet any other man with any culture as different as you could imagine from yours, so you have nothing in common, so to speak. You can speak, you can argue, but you have not the same background and the same culture, and the same religion, the same race, and so on. Is there a starting point for a discussion? The starting point is that you can assume that this guy wants desperately to be happy. There is no human being who would say, I have no interest in being happy. Even the worst of them, all the most terrible evildoers, they have done evil, they are killed people, they destroyed civilization, just because they imagined it was the only way for them to reach some happiness. So this is the unconditional certitude you can assume in any discussion. There is a kind of rationality there. And it's a very strange rationality, because we all desire happiness at any price. And nevertheless, we have no idea of what happiness is, which is very strange. It is precisely because of that we want to get it. So there is a very radical but universal logic, logos, of the desire for happiness. And the first centuries of Christian theology, so to speak, because this term theology has to be taken with some reservation, were for a large part, focusing on these debates. We all want to be happy. Pagans' God cannot help. We, Christians, we have a solution, which is not unknown to the Jews, which is not unknown to the Greek philosophers. And so it is a logos, but I would say deeper than a logos allowing us to have a scientific approach to the thing in the word. It is deeper a logos about the happiness of the speaking one. So those were my additional remarks, but I agree completely to what Rémi has brilliantly explained.
Friends, since we're almost at the end of the prescribed time, I think we have time for a brief response from Professor Brague and perhaps a reply, and that would conclude our evening.
Well, as a matter of fact, just some words of thanks. Jean-Luc's merits are all the greater that the poor fellow, for stupid technical reasons, could not access the text of my presentation before, well, this afternoon, 2 o'clock, something like that. I had sent it via email, and it was lost in the sand. Well, just 2 points. You were absolutely right to remind the audience that the title Athens, Jerusalem, and something more alludes to a very old polemics reviving the opposition supposed by Tertullian against 2 poles that, according to his opinion, could not be brought together. The use of the Tertullian's quotation by modern thinkers is relatively recent. You know, we can find elements of this opposition in Heinrich Heine, the German poet, who made supposed a conflict between the Christian and the Greek and the Nazarene. He said Nazarene in order to put into under the same heading Judaism and Christianity. Matthew Arnold spoke of Hebraism and Hellenism. Well, there's a whole tradition that leads to through Lev Shestov, the Russian philosopher, who published his Afin Jerusalem in 1937, and this idea came to a head, found its crowning achievement in Strauss's, in Leo Strauss's essay. I was not alluding to those kind of things, but it's right to to draw sort of the backdrop on which my present-day presentation could possibly make sense. A second point. Martyrdom as logical sort of activity. I would introduce an idea that I should have mentioned, but failed for some reason to bring to the fore. The notion of paresia. Yeah. Paresia. You know, there's not only the psychological state that enables somebody to speak out, to confess, sort of, but a moral duty, not to lie. When asked, are you a Christian? The answer must be yes, and at all costs. And this is the deepest point, perhaps, of paresia, the point on which whole life is, put at stake, in several meanings of the word, including the most concrete pillory. Okay, well then, thank you for those observations that give evidence to a long familiarity with those people on which I know that you are teaching.
Thank you. No, I think the important point is at least to get rid of this opposition as seen in Jerusalem, which of which the inadequacy is, after all, obvious. First, because when people say Jerusalem, they are not very clear about what moment of Jerusalem. Before, after the temple, what about the Exodus? What do people mean when they say Judaism? It is not clear for present Jewish people. How could it be such a simple category in the opposition to the Greeks? The other thing is, what do we mean when we say Athens? At what moment do we include the historical Athens with the Greek culture in the Hellenistic period as well? Or do we include the philosophy, the philosophical tradition which was born from Greek philosophy, up to what level of modernity? So those kind of opposition, which in fact have played a very important role in modern biblical studies and modern studies in the history of dogmatic, mostly in Germany, those oppositions are very, very questionable. And the third point is that what we know now about what we used to call patristic period is that you can accuse the father of the church of two opposite crimes, and those accusations are still alive. On one side, you can say they have destroyed the original Judaity of Christianity by compromising with Greek philosophy, which is, for instance, completely wrong if we consider the question of Arianism. Or you can say, it was said, I refer to that by referring to Nietzsche and some others, Christianity has corrupted the genuine Greek spiritual culture. So if you can say one thing and the opposite as to reproach to the same intellectual position, it means that the question is not correctly asked and perhaps has no real meaning.
So friends, with that, we've come to the end of the hour. And our only remaining responsibility then would be to thank our speakers once again for such an intellectual feast.